1,000 years ago, Europe learned one of the harshest lessons in economic history. Sometimes paying the enemy can be cheaper than fighting them. However, this is the story of the Danegeld payment arrangement, which began as a desperate ransom and over time turned into an early tax system. This was essentially a simple protection payment, only presented under the appearance of diplomacy. And the most frightening thing is that the logic behind it never disappeared. Even today, we continue to live under different versions of Danegeld. The only difference is that those who collect it now wear suits instead of chainmail. Imagine this: the year is 991. The English countryside is burning, and Viking longships have returned once again. These were not small-scale attacks. These were organized, ruthless raids with the power to destroy entire settlements. At the Battle of Malden, English forces confronted the Viking invaders and were defeated. The Vikings did not settle for just looting. They demanded payment to leave. King Ethelred, the Unready, who would later be known as the Unready, agreed to pay them 10,000 pounds of silver. This was an incredibly large amount for that time. This payment became the beginning of a system that would affect English rulers for decades. Danegeld literally meant Danish money. This was not just a one-time bribe. It turned into an institution. At first glance, it may look like cowardice. Why would you pay invaders instead of fighting them? However, the logic was entirely economic. Armies were expensive. Wars consumed treasuries and weakened kingdoms. A large silver payment, although painful, was faster and often a cheaper solution. You can think of it as an early cost-benefit calculation. By paying the Vikings today, preventing tomorrow's destruction. But of course, once you start paying, those payments never truly end. The Vikings understood the psychology of tribute better than anyone. They had established a protection system on a national scale. By the beginning of the 11th century, Danegeld payments had reached enormous levels. In 1012, King Ethelred paid the Vikings 48,000 pounds of silver. Just 2 years later, another 72,000 pounds were paid. By comparison, an ordinary peasant might only see a few silver coins in their entire lifetime. These numbers were not amounts that ordinary people could comprehend. However, kings did not pay this money from their own pockets. This burden was placed on the people. It was collected through taxes. It was taken from farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. What began as a desperate bribe turned into a royal revenue system. What began as a payment forcibly taken by foreign invaders soon turned into a tool that kings used to increase their own power. Why wait for Vikings to demand silver if you could use the same system to build armies, construct castles, or increase your political power? This was an ironic situation. The Vikings had taught Europe how systematic taxation worked. Payments that began to keep invaders away became the foundation of centralized state financing. Massive silver hoards were found throughout Scandinavia, coins minted in England, Germany, and the Islamic world. These were not just the spoils of random plunder. These were the products of Danegeld. Silver was flowing north like a river. For a Viking leader, this was far more efficient than constant war. If a king gives you his wealth just in exchange for leaving, why would you fight? However, the real power was in psychology. When a ruler made a payment, he showed his weakness. This encouraged other Viking leaders. The system became an addiction for both those who collected and those who paid. This was one of the first large-scale protection systems in European history. And like every protection system, it encouraged more demands. Over time, this system became part of the state itself. Rulers realized that they could collect large amounts of wealth from the people. Danegeld was no longer just a payment made to Vikings. It was an institutionalized tax system. During the reign of Nut the Great, Danegeld became routine. The ones who once demanded tribute were now sitting on the throne. Raiders had turned into tax collectors. The line between extortion and governance had completely disappeared. And this system continued even after the invasions ended. Once a source of revenue is created, it is rarely removed. Danegeld became a mechanism in which wealth flowed from the lower parts of society to the upper parts. Peasants worked. The state collected. Those in power spent. And the most remarkable truth was this. This logic never disappeared. In the modern world, governments rescue large institutions during times of crisis. Taxes are increased. Debts grow. The justification is always the same: to prevent a greater disaster. 1,000 years ago, silver was being loaded onto Viking ships. Today, money is being transferred into digital accounts. However, the system did not change. The lesson of Danegeld is simple. When a system learns to sustain itself, it can continue forever. Names change, methods change, but the mechanism remains the same.